Hi there, everyone. Thank you very much for joining our webinar today. My name is Emma Pyke. I'm an organizer with the Alberta Federation of Labour, and I'm excited to be hosting today. I'm just going to take a quick second here to confirm that I can be seen. Yes, I can. Okay, great. All right, back into it then. We were already eager to put a session on to discuss the state of public education in Alberta. And then the government introduced a bill recently that they're calling a Choice in Education Act, which added more fuel to our fire. While we're all having to grapple with a global health pandemic and how that's impacting our lives, the Alberta government is trying to take advantage and push through a very ideological bill that seeks to weaken our public education system in favor of privatization disguised as choice. So today we have three great panelists who will lead a discussion to help all of us better understand the challenges in our current education system, the impacts on workers, on students, and what the future of the system could look like should this government continue on its course to privatize and dismantle public education in the province. So thank you again for joining. A lot of important information to cover, and we only have an hour, so I'll keep it tight here, but I'll just quickly mention a couple of things about the technology we're using, Zoom. So first, please just remain muted so that we don't have some sound quality issues. Second, we will be taking questions, so please do, if you have questions, please ask them. We do ask that you use the Q&A function, which if you hover your mouse over the screen, you should see Q&A on the bottom of your screen. So if you click in there, you can ask us questions. You can also choose to ask them anonymously by just clicking the little anonymous box in there if you're more comfortable with that. There's also a comment area on the right-hand side of the screen where you can chat with other attendees, send us comments and so forth. But just to reiterate, if you do have a question, please use the question and answer function. It just helps us keep them organized and avoid missing questions. Okay, so at this point, I am going to turn it over and ask the wonderful panelists that we have here to introduce themselves. And from there, Barbara is going to take us through a brief history, helping us to understand how we got here before we continue on. So Bridget, would you mind going first there?
Great. Hi, everyone. So my name is Bridget Stirling, and I am a PhD student in the Department of Educational Policy Studies at the University of Alberta, where my work looks at the politics of education and childhood, especially around questions around parental rights and children's rights. And I'm also an Edmonton Public School Board trustee.
Great. Thanks, Bridget. Barbara.
Hi, my name is Barbara Silva, and I'm the Communications Director with Support Our Students. I'm just checking to make sure my video started there. Okay. Sorry, I couldn't see myself. That was taking me a while there. Public education advocate, started in 2015 advocating for equitable and accessible public education. Our goal in what we do is to inform, engage, and arm public citizens, Albertans, so that we can better effectively advocate for public education in the province.
Wonderful, thank you. And over to you, Leanne.
Hi, thank you. My name is Leanne Kalin, and I am an educational assistant with St. Albert Public Schools. I'm also the president of CUPE Local 1099, which is St. Albert Public Schools.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you again to each of you for being here. I'm going to turn it over to you, Barbara, to help us figure out how we've got to this point with public education in Alberta.
Okay, I'm going to try to be relatively quick because I think that there's a lot of other discussions to have around here, but I'm going to do a very quick synopsis of where we started and where we are right now. Going back to 1905, which is when the public and the separate boards were created. That's sort of the initial starting point. In 1967, we started funding private schools in Alberta. In 1993, under Klein started the defunding process, right? That's really where we started to see our current system take place and take effect, and that competition model get put into into motion. And so in 1993, Ralph Klein cut funding for education wages by 5%. He eliminated kindergarten. He amalgamated the 140 some odd school boards into 60 at the time. And then most notoriously in 1994, introduced charter schools. And it's the same time as they were introduced in the United States, and under the exact same premise, which was to be hotbeds of pedagogical research and innovation. They would only exist for 5 years and then be rolled back into the public system. They were privately run but publicly funded organizations. And by definition, they were always meant to meet the specific needs of a specific group of students. They were never meant to meet all students' needs. And so that's kind of where we started this competition model. We were sort of sold this idea. And of course, it was backed up by the fact that funding follows the student in Alberta, which is essentially a voucher. In Alberta, the voucher goes directly to the school board. In the States, it goes to the parent and then to the school. But this is when schools started have to compete for funding. And so they started with these sort of gimmicks and niche programs. And this is why we now all of a sudden feel we need hockey schools or ballet schools or science schools. And that was the competition model. In 2008, over the summer, the then PC government increased private school funding from 60% per student funding to 70% per student funding, which is the highest rate of funding in Canada. There are only 5 provinces in Canada that currently support and fund private schools. Alberta is the only province in Canada to legislate charter schools. I'll just quickly add that charter schools originally had a cap of only 15 schools allowed in the province. They're predominantly in Calgary or Edmonton. And having said that, one school, under the designation, one school can have more than one campus. So for example, in Calgary, Foundations for the Future Charter Academy is classified as one school, but it has 7 campuses. And so that's sort of how they got around that legislation. So that's where we are today. We have a proliferation of choice. We have schools that run the gamut, like I said, from hockey schools to traditional learning centers, from gifted programming to science schools. We fund private schools higher than any other province in the country, and we have an overabundance of choice. So that's where we're at right now, and I think that sort of sets the stage for the Choice in Education Act.
Great.
Yeah, thank you. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Bridget.
No,
Please.
go ahead. Or
I just gonna say thanks.
I'll just go ahead. So I think I'll take it from here and sort of talking through recent changes both in the Education Act and through the Choice in Ed Act. Because I think it's really important to know that the Choice in Education Act builds on some changes that came in with Bill 8 last year. So I think most of us are familiar with the conversation around Bill 8. I think for most of us was really focused around GSAs. Most of us are familiar with what happened around privacy for LGBTQ students and other things. But there were some other pieces of the Education Act that were really important. So first was that in terms of school choice conversations, one of which was that boards began to be allowed to offer programs outside of their own boundaries if a local board has approved it. So even for public school boards, what this enabled was for public boards to be able to sort of move into other division spaces if the local division didn't want to offer a program. The second thing was that, as Barb mentioned, there was a cap on charters, and the Education Act lifted that cap. So despite the fact that we only had 13 of the 15 charters that were or charter cap, we only have 13 in Alberta. It removed the cap with the idea that there was suddenly going to be a huge demand for charters. And it reduced one of the barriers to charter schools, which was that charters no longer had to demonstrate significant community support, which I think was a really substantial change. And the final piece that I think was important was in terms of how we talk about charter schools is that the school fee cap was removed. So the NDP had brought in a cap on school fees, and that cap was removed, which then sort of opened up a lot of space for schools to start charging much higher fees. So that changed the landscape, but what we didn't see was a stampede of new charter school applications. There have been, as the minister herself admitted, there have been no charter applications come in since they formed government. So we see with the Choice in Ed Act a substantial push further towards the expansion of school choice. The first of which is, maybe I'll go through sort of the changes to charters first. So we saw the addition for charters to be able to begin to offer what's called vocational school programming. So this requirement, first of all, expands what can be under a charter's mandate, because previously they had to be offering something innovative or distinct from what was already available in public systems. That's no longer required. And the vocational programming, unlike the other forms of charter, also there's no non-compete clause to it. So those programs can duplicate programming that's already available in public systems, and that sort of circumvents that rule. Another piece is that charters will no longer be required to first go to their local school division to request an alternative program. So up until now, if somebody wanted to establish a charter, they would first have to approach their public school division or Catholic school division to request that an alternative program be established. That is no longer a requirement. So they can just go right around that to the minister. Charters have also now been exempted from the board procedures regulation, and this has been sort of legitimized as well. They already have to comply with the rules under the Societies Act, or under the Companies Act as societies. A lot of people don't know a charter is not actually public in terms of its governance. They're actually nonprofit societies or nonprofit companies registered under the Companies Act, and they no longer have to comply with the board regulations. So there's a much lower bar in terms of bylaws. And they are exempted from being potentially drawn into joint use agreements or joint planning agreements with municipalities, which means even if they are taking over schools that are on municipal reserve land or things like that, they can no longer be subjected to those agreements around JUAs. A couple of other substantial changes, one of which was the expansion of what homeschooling can be. Homeschoolers previously had to file and have an approved plan under the supervision of a school board of some form. And now there's an additional option for an entirely unsupervised form of homeschooling. Those homeschoolers will no longer receive provincial funding, but they also no longer have to have their educational plan approved. They only have to file the plan, but it's only notification. There's no approval required. And the last piece, which I think is really substantial, and a lot of people don't understand how substantial this really is some of the changes in language around school choice. So we've seen private schools endorsed as important, not just existing, but important to the government's educational mandate, as integral to our school system. And we've seen the addition of section 26.3 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which sets out that parents have the prior right to determine the education of their children without the balancing requirements under 26.1 or 26.2 around what that education should look like, or any of the protections for children under the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. And I can probably talk a bit more about that later, but that's an overview of kind of what changes have come in with this legislation. It's much more substantial than most people realize. So I will pass it on then to, I think, over to Leanne next.
Yeah, I'll just jump in really quick to say thanks, Bridget. I know there's a lot of different, strings you pull, and it can you can keep going on different parts for a while. So we will come back for sure about that last piece about the human rights piece. But yeah, Leanne, I would love to ask you, just because you work in the system, and recently, because of the global health pandemic, so they say, there was a massive layoff, one of, if not the biggest public layoff in Alberta history. So So I want to ask you about what is the experience for you as somebody in that with your local 1099? What are you hearing from your staff? What's the morale like? You know, what's the status of these layoffs? Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. You know what? For what's happening with all these layoffs, and it was the single largest layoff in one single day in Alberta history, and it was absolutely devastating to all the members who across Alberta who had been given their layoff notices. In my local, we had 61% of our memberships, 214 out of just almost 400, well, it was like 396 members that were laid off. So all of the educational assistants in our district, all of the librarians, and all of our food workers were laid off effective April 30th. So remaining in at working would be our maintenance workers, our custodian caretakers, and our administrative assistants. And you know, we recognize that there is still the importance of work that needs to be done in our district. So we understand that there had to be somebody, and there had to be people that remained working throughout this pandemic, you know, and this is actually providing a good opportunity for the caretakers in the schools to actually be getting some work done that they've had to put to the side just because their workload has been, you know, just growing every year. Not, you know, fortunately, you know, some school boards, they've decided to keep, you know, a lot of their staff. And like I said, my division, we were fortunate to keep some of our staff. But not every board has been able to actually keep their staff. And, you know, and it's because the government has, this province has made it difficult. It's the government that is actually making the school divisions make some very hard decisions and very uncomfortable decisions, unfortunately. And, you know, we have to also look at how governments react to crises, right? To when we're in a crisis like this, and the long-term lasting effects that actually happen. And unfortunately, this COVID, you know, crisis, it's created the perfect opportunity for the government to take advantage of public services. You know, we see it in the healthcare, we're seeing it in public education, and it's just going to be happening more and more. And it's created the perfect storm just for this government to weaken unions. And, you know, by laying off thousands of public service workers, you know, that's what's I guess, you know, assisting and weakening these unions, but also by pushing bills through, like Bill, you know, 15, you know, through the legislature, you know, and unfortunately, some workers, I mean, they're worried about what the fall is going to look like. What is it going to be, you know, when we return? You know, I mean, people, my members of their morale is quite low, understandably. And then, you know, there's also the ones that are still working. They're actually feeling guilty because they're actually remaining on the job. So there's some of that that's happening. But, you know, people are worried about the uncertainty of what the fall is going to look like. Will we have jobs? You know, will our jobs be the same? And what happens if the schools go back and it's only in the limited capacity, right? So like, what does that mean for the support staff? So does that mean that there's going to still be less support staff put in place, which means that we're still going to be having people who are laid off? You know, and I mean, staff have been subject to layers of cuts over this last year, and it adds a lot of uncertainty, and it also makes us feel like our work is not valued. And you know, we know that students and parents and staff, that they appreciate and they value our work and the work that we do, but we just wish that this government would actually appreciate and value, you know, the working people of Alberta. This government is constantly saying that they're here for Albertans, yet they go and lay off 20,000 plus education workers in one single day. That's hardly a government that works for Alberta. You know, with cuts stacking up, it's also hard on the staff to see the areas get underfunded, right? And so that's why we're pushing that all public money remain in the public education system.
That last point is a great spot to, certainly articulate. Sorry for everything you and your members are going through. Thank you very much for sharing that. That's not easy. See somebody in the comments saying, all EAs in local 2545 are laid off, morale's low. So, it's a tough time for sure. And actually, lends to another, it's like this larger attack in general on public education. I wonder if Bridget or Barbara, you want to talk a little bit about this continuous attack on even the governance structures. We saw this audit ordered of the Calgary Board of Education that seemed like they were trying to bully their way through something, and the audit found that there was no reckless spending, but the minister was making some pretty inflammatory remarks, and I just wonder what I know you both work are closely involved in all of this. I wonder what you think about that.
Well, I'll jump in. I think it was very predictable. So long before even Kenny took office, I think it was very obvious that if he got into power, if he became the Premier of Alberta, that there would be a clear attack on public education. The reality is that a pandemic or a crisis, whether it's a hurricane in New Orleans or COVID in Alberta, that Conservative governments are going to capitalize and exploit those opportunities to attack public education. So it's no surprise to us that they're going to attack the largest school board in Western Canada. If they can break the largest school board in Western Canada, so bring down public education while simultaneously promoting choice and privately run schools, which have, make no mistake, charter schools are privately run organizations. They're publicly funded, but they're privately run. So this is market creation 101. And I'd also like to sort of point out that I think Jason Kenney expected when he lifted the cap on charter schools that there would be a massive influx of applications for charter schools in Alberta. When he said Alberta was open for business, he wasn't kidding. And education was not supposed to be exempt from that. So the fact that no one actually applied for charter schools, I think eats away at Kenney. And so the Choice in Education bill was an opportunity to advertise even louder, to make it even easier when he removes the restrictions of having to go through school boards, when he removes other restrictions, when he actually allows charter schools to own property and invest in equity, which is how nonprofits actually profit, is by building equity, real estate. That's what Bill 15 really is. It's an advertisement that Alberta is open for business, that public education is for sale. And so that, combined with continued attacks on public school boards, namely Calgary, is how you push privatization. And the reason he's chosen charter schools, which is really interesting, is because there are a lot of people who will stand by charter schools, right? It's the most palatable. If he came out and said, no, we're going to privatize, you can see by the reaction that Albertans had to Dan Williams comparing liquor stores to privatizing public education. People, that blatant language is uncomfortable for people. But if you can sell a little bit of charter, still call it a public, not have big fees, but have multiple entrance requirements, still have a sense of exclusivity achieved through a charter school, then what you're selling is privatization by a different name. But make no mistake, it's still privatization. And that's why Kenney is focused on charters more than privates, because it's an easier sell.
Maybe I'll add a bit to both of these pieces. I think Barb raises really good points in both pieces. The attack on CBE certainly is partly because they're the largest school board in Western Canada, and breaking them is really, really important. I think they're also a scapegoat to scare the rest of the school boards to get into line. There's a couple of things that attacking CBE does, right? First of all, it allows for a distraction from the education cuts in Calgary, which is sort of, to hold government in Alberta, you have to hold 2 of 3 pieces, right? You have to hold 2 of Edmonton, Calgary, and rural Alberta, right? So they know that Edmonton's kind of a lost cause, but in Calgary and rural Alberta, that's their base of strength. The education cuts, because of the way they're structured, most substantially harm the large metro boards. The faster a board is growing and the more students they have, this weighted moving average and a number of other structures harm them the most. And so to attack CBE allows for a distraction, right? Because they can blame CBE for the problems parents are starting to see in schools rather than their own cuts. So that's part of it. It also scares the rest of the school boards into line. And you see this often, right? So CBE is being threatened with being fired. And what happens is you start to see other school divisions other school boards, rather than standing up for CBE, get scared, they get quiet, and they get less vocal, right? Like, and I see that impulse among other trustees often. So it's quite a concern. The second piece is around sort of Barb's point about the creeping privatization of Bill 15. It's a really good point, right? Charters, if we saw the province suddenly declare we're going to bump up the private school funding from the 70% to 100% per student grant, I think most people in Alberta would get quite upset, especially right now while funding is short. So instead, in the meantime, while our budgets are being cut, so what happens instead is you just open the door for more schools to come in through the charter door, right? So you reduce the requirements for charters to comply with the same standards that public school boards do, to meet the same regulatory requirements, and to go through the publics. And you then also, they get the 100% per student grant because they're funded like a public school. We also, unfortunately, even under the NDP, saw an increase in infrastructure funding and things like that to charter schools, which has moved them closer to being like public schools. So we saw charters getting provincial infrastructure funding to build new schools for the first time. Also, I think, and this is probably a good piece for Leanne to talk to too, is the difference in unionization between public school divisions and private schools, which I think another piece of this is an attempt to break education unions. And maybe I think Leanne would be a good person to fill in a bit more on what's going on there.
Yeah, it's funny, right before you said that, Bridget, somebody had just, written about, basically how charter schools don't involve the ATA, so they don't have abilities and rights to contract negotiations and so forth. But yeah, Leanne, I would love to hear you pick up on that.
Yeah, to actually try and organize. I mean, any group of workers in Alberta can organize into a union. However, it would be increasingly more difficult to actually try and unionize in a private school or even in a charter school. I don't believe that any of the charter schools in Alberta are unionized with support staff.
Yeah, thanks very much. So I think we have quite a few comments and questions starting to flow in. So actually, I'm gonna maybe just, it's okay with everybody, we're just gonna start trying to address some of these thoughts and questions. So this first one, and I've seen it reflected in a couple of places here now, effectively, we know that the government is trying to do this, trying to move towards privatization. What are you guys' thoughts on how do we fight this?
Well, my one suggestion is to contact your MLA, start writing to the MLA, have those, phone your MLAs. MLAs are traditionally in their offices on Friday afternoons, so that would be a perfect opportunity for you to sit down with them, try to encourage them to not vote in favor of passing Bill 15.
I mean, for my part, from a public education advocacy organization part, I think there's a lot that we need to do in terms of understanding what privatization means. I think one of the reasons that we've gotten to the point that we've gotten is because the privatization model hasn't been so over the top or hitting you over the head with tuition or fees. It's very obvious that a private school like Weber Academy is a private school. It has an $18,000 tuition. There's a clear barrier. But I think we really need to start to get honest and having conversations, not just about what the current system looks like that we have, which has a significant amount of barriers. We currently have public schools in Alberta that have entrance exams, that have applications, that have wait lists, where kids have to travel across the city to access them. In the Northeast Calgary, there are no second language programs other than French. They have to travel across the city to access Spanish bilingual, or across the city to access the science program. So I think we really need to start we have to know what we're fighting for. Of course, we're fighting against privatization, but what is the dream? What is it that we want for all children? Who chooses? Why does any school end with an acceptance procedure or an acceptance letter? If the school is accepting you, that is not a public school. So it's important to fight against privatization, and privatization, again, is not just a tuition. Privatization is any barrier of access. Note that rural children across Alberta don't have anywhere near the amount of choice that urban students do. But also understand that, you know, the wealthiest and the most privileged among us never choose. So those kids who are getting a $30,000 education, $20,000 in tuition, and an additional $7,000 or $8,000 from the government of subsidized public dollars are getting science programs, second language programs, comprehensive arts programs, comprehensive science programs. They have a place to eat lunch that isn't on a gym floor or a hallway. They have educational assistants, music teachers, and actual librarians. So do we want that for students, and do we want it for all students? Because if we want it for all students, it's not enough to fight privatization unless you know what you want. And what we have to want for all children is proper supports, small class sizes, proper cleaning of our schools, particularly during a pandemic, playgrounds for all students, comprehensive gym class. Why do we have a science school? What does that mean for every other school? That they don't get a good science curriculum? So have these conversations with people so that we can understand what it is we're fighting for and not just what we're fighting against. Because until we have a vision and tell people what we want, listen, all politicians are the same and they want your vote. It's up to us to show them what they need to do to get our vote. They will chase. We know very well about vote chasing. So it's time to make them chase us instead of us chasing them.
Thanks very much, Barbara. Bridget, did you want to also add to?
Yeah, I actually sort of there and sort of to the next question on the list, because I think they're very interrelated, is, you know, conversations with MLAs are really, really hard for people who live in some communities where they're dealing with backbench UCP MLAs who aren't very responsive. That doesn't mean you can't organize, but writing letters is not enough, right? Like I think we're often encouraged to write letters to our MLAs, and I think it's a great step. But you also have to be ready to go out and have conversations in your community. Just like if you are trying to organize for a union, you need to talk to other people in your workplace, right? If you are trying to organize to get political action, you have to do more than write individual letters. You have to go out and organize in your community. Parents are actually really good people who are really well positioned to do that. They have networks of other parents. They're often, and I know it's tougher right now because we're not playing soccer and stuff as much right now, but you know, you're often in contact with other parents through the different work that you do. You know, volunteer organizations, your kids' sports, your school councils, all of these things. And these are spaces in which you can have conversations with other parents. And I think you do need to talk about what happens when dollars start to be hived off and families start to be hived off from public school systems, because the most active families are often the people who have the resources and the funds and the time to be able to organize. And when those families start to get drawn away into private systems and charter systems, they're less likely to speak up for public schools. We start to see funding diverted from public schools. We know that public schools have economies of scale and school divisions where we can do more things when we have more resources all together. It's like anything, when we pool our stuff together, we can do more. So we need to talk about that. I think we also need to counter this language of the public charter school. Charter schools aren't public, right? They will use the fact that they're publicly funded and publicly regulated to claim that means they're a public school. They're not. The administration and the governance of charter schools is not public, right? And that's the difference. The people who get to vote for the board at the charter school are not all citizens in a community. They are only the people who participate directly in that school. The administration of that school is not publicly accountable in the same way, right? They're accountable to that private board, right? So it's really important for us to talk about why public accountability public administration and public governance are important, right? I think one of the comparisons a good friend of mine made recently is it's a lot like the conversation around healthcare and long-term care, right? So the comparison, you know, we all know the difference between, you know, we all know that whether they're nonprofit or for-profit, private long-term care is not the same as public long-term care, and it is the same thing in schools, right? Nonprofit, privatized schools are still privatized.
And I'd also like to add just a couple of things. One is that charter schools and private schools don't outperform public schools, period, full stop. Know where they've been introduced. Charter schools, regardless of where they've been introduced, as public selective programming, whether, you know, Ontario has some of selective schools, they're not charter schools. In the States, in Australia, these programs have never outperformed. What they have done is they've widened inequity, they've created exclusivity under the public umbrella, they've siphoned public dollars, diluted public funding, they break unions, they introduce a way to profit off of public schools. And make no mistake, non-profit does not mean no profit. Non-profits are a tax status, okay? FIFA, the Federation International of Football, is the largest profiting nonprofit in the world with billions of dollars in the account. So the other thing that the Education Act lifted was a charter's ability to own property. And there's a reason why, as individuals, the greatest asset most people fortunate enough to own their own home, or why you're told to buy a home, is because the greatest equity you can have is in real estate. Charter boards now can have and own their own real estate. That's public dollars for private equity. So let's not be convinced that a science school gives you a better education. We produced engineers without a science program long before 1994. We produced fabulous artists long before the Arts Academy. We actually even produced artists, engineers, accountants, lawyers, welders, and artists from rural communities too. This is a facade, it's a perceived advantage, and it's marketing, okay? So those principles are the same principles we apply in anything else. The reason Alpa will sell you an iPhone 10 isn't because your iPhone 6 doesn't work anymore, or that you don't need it anymore. It's because they purposely make your iPhone 6 the battery die, right? They purposely make sure that apps don't work. They purposely make sure that there are ways in which your 6 isn't as effective, and they create a market for you to want something else. This is what charter schools does. This is what privatization does. It's under the guise of choice, but the reality is only the most privileged in our society have that choice, and schools decide, not parents. Parents apply, but schools decide. And this is a dangerous precedent to set for public education in this province, and then and wider in Canada if any other province follows this lead.
I want to come back to this real estate piece for a minute too, because I think this is a really important change in the Choice in Education Act, is around the public infrastructure question. So we've seen for quite some time public school divisions forced to turn over infrastructure to private schools for little to no compensation for that infrastructure, or forced to rent it at very, very low rates, and it impacts the utilization rate calculations, all kinds of things for public schools, that then harms the ability of public schools to get new infrastructure as they need it. It creates problems. And the contracts on those buildings often don't include, they include some maintenance costs, but they don't include the major modernization costs and things like that for those buildings. So school divisions are still on the hook for the deferred maintenance on the building. Now, with charter schools starting to receive infrastructure funding from the public, and yet not being subject to joint use agreements, not being subject to municipal reserve agreements and stuff like that, what that represents is a transfer of public infrastructure funding into private hands. And I know that's really nerdy around infrastructure, but I think it's really important, right? Like, we are putting money that should be going into our public school infrastructure into building new schools, so that kids in growing neighborhoods and in metro jurisdictions can actually have enough room to go to school, so they're not packed into the gym and the library and everywhere else. And also,
the reason that's important, Bridget, is because one of the most righteous things that Albertans love to say is that, well, our charter schools are nonprofit. We're nothing like the States because our charter schools are nonprofit. And the reality is, even in the States, 85% of the charters in the United States are actually nonprofit as well. So
most of our private schools.
Yeah. Yeah. Or charities have charitable status even.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and So what happens is we start to give them, it's like subsidizing infrastructure for any other private organization. Like, we need to consider, like, this should be public infrastructure, right? If it's supposedly a public school, then the infrastructure should be held by the public. And if they're not subject to joint use agreements, once the building is transferred into that charter school's hands, then it's out of the public's hands because it's no longer theirs.
Thank you for very comprehensive answers. I'm going to do a quick plug for Barbara's organization as well, which is called Support Our Students, or SOS, which does incredible work on this file. And it ties into, what can we do? Well, if you're looking for language to help you have these conversations, just look at what Barb's organization is doing. The AFL also has a really comprehensive blog on education, which I will grab the link and post after I ask this next question. Oh, no, go ahead, Barbara.
Just a very, very quick thing. So Support Our Students Alberta is just on the cusp of posting an advocacy toolkit. So it's going to be something that you can download the entire document, or you can download pieces that you want, but it's literally going to be a toolkit, a how to advocate on different things, and a lot of information will be within it. Like what is a voucher? What does a voucher look like? Why is it different from the states? What's a nonprofit? What's a charter? And all of those things. So stay tuned. That's on our website, hopefully coming up pretty quickly, hopefully within I don't know. If I say a week, it'll be a month. So I'm not going to give it a date, but it's coming up.
That's awesome. That kind of stuff is very helpful. Thank you for doing that. So, okay, we're going to move on to another question here. Says, thank you for your point about exclusivity and the numerous paths to excluding students. I've also noticed a change in language regarding private schools. They are being referred to as independent schools when being spoken about by our premier in particular. Not a question, but an important statement that I think there's something to be said about.
Yeah, I think the language is really important. So they call them government schools and independent schools. That's what education, so they used to call them education reformers, and then a very prominent advocate, Diane Ravitch, has started calling them education disruptors. And this is the right wing, a neoconservative group that want, the Betsy DeVosses, for lack of a better term, who want to disrupt public education. They use the language of government schools for public and independent schools. They also talk about, we talked about this in our Parkland Institute session, some other language issues. For example, equity and choice. So conservatives have now co-opted very progressive terms, equity and choice, and they now talk about the equity of choice. So this now means you have the right to choose where your kid's going to go, what they're going to learn, even if what they're going to learn is creationism. Even if what they're going to learn is not about gender diversity, even if what they're going to learn is, that climate change doesn't exist. The other piece of the puzzle, and you hear Jason Kenney talk about this quite a bit, actually, and he did when they announced Bill 15, is pluralism. Pluralism is a religious term. So when he talks about pluralism, they set that in place of diversity. Okay, so they try to use those synonymously, but pluralism is a nod to the religious base. And so when he talks about that our education system has to represent pluralism, that's where that fundamentalist homeschooling with no oversight and no funding comes into play, where you can have people choosing to teach children about flat earth or, again, no gender diversity, homophobia, that climate change is a hoax, all of those things. So then that's when we start to talk about, and this is more, maybe more Bridget's jam than mine in terms of what she studies, but the idea that parental choice supersedes children's rights. And that's where Kenny is going. He's talking about the parent having more choice than a child has a right to an equitable and accessible and universal, comprehensive public education.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Barb, and it's really at the heart of my academic work and my research is often this language around parental choice and parental rights is sort of written over top of the rights and choice of children, right? Children who are put into some of these educational circumstances don't get much of a choice in what they get to learn, right? And what happens in picking it out, if you look at the Declaration of Human Rights, which they pick 26.3 out of, you know, they say parents have the prior right to choose the kind of education that shall be given to their children is 26.3. What it leaves out is 26.2, which is education shall be developed directed to the full development of the human personality and to the strengthening of respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. It shall promote understanding, tolerance, and friendship among all nations, racial or religious groups, and shall further the activities of the United Nations for the maintenance of peace. Right. So picking out the one piece without the other, and then also completely ignoring the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which Alberta, we kind of dragged our feet on it. We were the last jurisdiction in Canada to endorse the Convention on the Rights of the Child, but we endorsed it in Alberta in 1999. You know, our province is supposed to be respecting it, and the UNCRC is quite extensive in talking about what the child's rights are in education, what they have the right to learn, their own right to have freedom of assembly and expression and thought and all kinds of things that this government has opposed for children. And I especially worry about this change to homeschooling. I worry about what that means for a child who's now in a completely unregulated, unsupervised homeschooling environment. And I know some parents who homeschool who are excellent homeschoolers, right? They do a great job. But no oversight, accountability, or responsibility here, with no supervision of the program. What happens to that child's right to have an education? You know, they're supposed to have a future out of their schooling. And when their parents' right to make these decisions about what they get to learn supersedes their right to have a good future from their education, this is a gross violation of the rights of children. And, you know, in my opinion, education is supposed to be for the student, for the child, right? Education is not for the parent, education is for the child.
I mean, I can jump in and add a couple of things, sorry.
I could see you getting ready, so.
Sorry, I have a lot to say, which comes as no surprise. You know, a couple of things. I think, you know, one of the things that we constantly have to discuss when we talk as Support Our Students Alberta, one is that we are not attacking the quality of the programming. Teachers in every school are working their butts off, so are educational assistants, so are principals. It's not, we're not concerned about the quality of the programming. Nobody is saying that an arts program is bad or that a science program is bad. What we're saying is that children should never have to choose one over the other. You certainly shouldn't have to do it by the time they're 6 years old. You certainly shouldn't have to get on a waiting list the second your child has a birth certificate, right? Some sort of legal documentation that they exist. So, and this is where we get into some trouble with parents who want to say, well, I love my programming. Absolutely, the programming is great. What we don't understand is why any child should have to choose it. And the other component to this is that people will say, well, how can we have it all? It's not possible. And that's what you've been sold. That's the rhetoric that you've been sold, because there are students who have it all. It happens. Where does it happen? It happens at the schools that have adequate funding. It happens at the schools where parents can pay to top up what public schools don't. It is possible. It's possible if we make it a priority, and it's possible if we fund it correctly. It's possible if we have a different vision for what public education can be, if we fund it with interministerial funding so that we understand that education and healthcare for children go hand in hand. And we understand that social services, the Ministry of Children's Services, also funds into education. We can do it. The problem is we've been left with scraps for so long, it's robbed us of a vision for a public education that meets the needs of all children across this province. And so one of the components of advocacy is dreaming big and making sure that we understand what it is that we want for public education. And if there's anything that this crisis presents for us, it's an opportunity to step back and say, you know what, 3 kids to a locker, no longer acceptable. You know what, my kids in a classroom with windows that don't actually open, no longer acceptable. 1 caretaker to a school for 400 students, not acceptable. So while neoconservatives and the right wing are using this time to undermine public education in order to create a market for privatization. We can do the same. We can take this opportunity to step back and say, you know what? It's not 40 kids in a classroom for 25 is no longer acceptable. And that is the challenge that lies before us. But the dreaming is free, and you can envision whatever you want. And then that's what we have to fight for.
Thanks very much for that, and for the reminder about thinking bigger, thinking different. I just want to quickly say we only have 10 minutes left. We're going to take a couple more questions, maybe only one, depending on the question. But there's a lot of other questions, and I want you to know that you can reach out to us afterwards. We're not going to get to them all, but I just wanted to let you know that we're not going to get to them all. But I will give you my email address so that you can reach out to me after if you want any follow-up. So anyways, the next question we have here in the queue is there any requirement in charter schools to prove that their staff have the right training and skills to teach and assist? So I guess you could also look at that as their benchmarks and qualifications that are expected. So yeah, Barbara, do you want to jump in there?
Yeah, so teachers and charters in Alberta have to be certified. So we don't get around that here. That is one of the differences between the American charter and the Canadian charter schools, is that for now, because I do not put it past this government to remove that. If still enough charter applications don't come forward, you can be rest assured that Kenny will continue to remove any type of restrictions to having a proliferation of charter schools. So as of this moment, teachers in charter schools have to be certified, yes.
So one of my concerns with the addition of the ability to have, and it's one of the conversations we've been having around this addition of the vocational school to the charter school possibilities, is we've also seen speculation for quite some time since Jeff Johnson, but we saw it in the UCP platform, and we saw Kenny talk about quite a bit the desire to have tradespeople, journey persons be able to teach with no additional teaching qualifications, to change the standards so that they could teach without any additional training and teaching. And my spouse is an electrician. I have huge respect for the teaching that goes on in the apprenticeship system. I'm going to preface that with this now, it's a really important system, but it's a very different context than teaching in a high school classroom. But one of the things I think is very, very possible with the addition of the vocational school, and a potential change to what the qualification requirements might be for people to have a teaching certificate to teach in a trades program, I think this may open the door to something very dangerous around charter schools. There is right now a good route for people with their journey person certification to get into teaching. Universities have an opportunity for those folks to do a B.Ed after degree, just like you can do after any other bachelor's degree. After a bachelor's degree, you can do a B.Ed after degree as a tradesperson. There's a route in. I think it's great to support and encourage that route. I'd love to see more people with trades training working in education, right? I think that's an important rule, but we need to make sure that people are in the same way given, trained with a proper B.Ed in the education on pedagogy and classroom management and all of those other important pieces that come along with that work. Yeah, I see someone in the comments noting that the Bachelor of Ed program recognizes journey certifications. Yeah, they absolutely do. And then you have to do some additional coursework, just like you have to do on an after degree. If you've got your, Bachelor of Science and you want to do your B.Ed, you get a shorter program, but you still have requirements to get the B.Ed. So it's really important.
I'm just going to quickly throw in there that, Jason Kenney's nod to vocational charter schools is really about academic streaming. Mm-hmm. So again, language, be careful. If it sounds nice, question it. So this is about academic streaming. When the curriculum panel review came out saying they wanted a Germanic model, this is about streaming kids at an earlier age. So by 13 or 14, your life trajectory is going to be set for you. So just throwing
How many of us had a really good idea when we were 12 years old of what we wanted to do with the rest of our life? Some people did, but I'm
I had a
certainly
great idea of what I would be doing. It's not
I
what
still don't know what I'm
I
doing.
did or anything to that effect, but okay, I'm going to sneak one last one in here. Will the Choice in Education Act open the door for private schools to apply for charter school status?
So I don't think that private schools will do that, mainly because charter schools can't charge fees, right? Well, they have removed the restrictions on fees, but they likely, maybe the private schools that don't charge huge tuitions will do that, so that they can go from 70% per student funding to 100% per student funding, and then charge $1,000 or $2,000 tuition under the guise of fees. Okay, so again, language is important. Tuition is what private schools charge. Fees are what public schools charge. It's still dollars out of your pocket one way or the other. But the high-end elite private schools are not likely to become charter schools. What I think is actually going to happen, especially because of the current pandemic, is a collective push to undermine public schools so that parents who have the ability to not send their children to school, who might be afraid, who might not like the overcrowding, who don't like the cleanliness of the school or the parameters that have been put in place, will opt to homeschool or online schooling. So, and what we see in the States right now is this incredible surge of online charter schools. And there's nothing more profitable in the world than an online charter school, because you don't need a building, you don't need a caretaker, you don't have to pay utilities. You get a kid with a computer, one teacher can teach 1,000 kids, unlimited, and then you pocket all of that difference. So this is I think they're salivating during this pandemic at the opportunity to continue to underfund public education at a time when parents are very concerned. Note that families who will not be able to not send their kids to school. So these are essential workers, people who are living in poverty or food insecurity, who will have to send their kids to public schools no matter what, won't have the time or opportunity to advocate for better work environments. And so what we're going to have the situation you see in a lot of parts of the world where the public system is for poor people. It'll be the poor man's choice. And if you can opt out, you will, and you'll have the opportunity to have a charter online school at 100% funding. And again, just following in the footsteps of countries around the world that have widened inequity, that have lower academic standards, that have lower or higher income gaps and inequality in their population and in their society. So we are at a very dangerous time. I think we don't have a lot of time to mobilize around this. Once you step foot back into a school with 40 kids in a classroom, it's going to be hard to advocate for class size. So now's the time to organize.
And I think we should think about how this works in conjunction with the shutdown of the Alberta Distance Learning Center. Right?
Sure, that's market creation, right? Perfect timing. Shut down the public system and open up a whole bunch of private opportunities. This is what they do. For all those parents who are saying my kids' needs aren't being met through the public system, I had to leave. That was not coincidence. That was by design.
Mm-hmm. And
that was entirely by design.
We hear this from parents who's, I've had these conversations with people. Well, why would I want to send my kid to the crumbling, underfunded public school when I could send them to the nice charter school instead, right? And we will hear that more and more, especially now that there's starting to be some public infrastructure funding for charters, which has been one of their challenges, is that they've had to substantially fund their own infrastructure needs. And now that they're starting to get nice new buildings built for them, like we're seeing in Calgary, with Foundations for the Future, I think that's going to be that's going to be the next step too, right?
Well,
I can stay for a few more hours.
I know, I'm thinking like, okay, should get a bottle of wine, we'll just have a couple of drinks and keep going. We could go on and on and on and on. Thank you so much. I am going to just wrap it here. We're at time. I can't thank you three enough. You've really provided such valuable perspectives. And I've learned a ton, even though I've been helping to put this together for days now. I still am just shocked at some of the things I hear. So thank you very much. I'll just quickly note to those who are still on here, I'll send a follow-up email tomorrow with a couple of links that we mentioned today, with my contact info if you didn't get to your question and you do want to keep seeking an answer on that. And I'll get the recording out there as well, because I know people are asking about that. Otherwise, I just want to leave us with one thing that was mentioned by the panelists as well. This is a time to dream. This is a time to think about what an education system would look like if it was to work perfectly for the children and not actually work, be concerned with other things. What do we want out of it? Like Barbara said, maybe we don't think about how many kids we can have using the same lockers anymore. We think about that's not right. Actually, when we go back, we're going to have everybody's able to have their safe spaces and everything. So please dream. Please don't feel discouraged, because we will continue all together to fight for public education. We're not the only jurisdiction who's facing this, so together we are going to keep fighting for this, and it's really important that we do so. So with that said, thank you all for attending. Hope everybody got something out of it, and have a great night.
Thank you for putting it on.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.